6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
The History with Jackson podcast. Hello and welcome to the History with Jackson podcast, the podcast where we bring up-to-date historical research to you in an accessible and digestible way. So hello and welcome back to the History of Jackson podcast. And today we welcome author, historian and good friend, Dr. Faith Tibble, to talk about her book, her fantastic new book, The Crown of Thorns, Humble Gods and Humiliated Kings. I've got my copy here. I couldn't put it down, honestly. But how are you doing, Faith?
Yeah, I'm really well. Thanks, Jackson. I'm excited to be here.
No, I'm really excited to talk about the book and talk about some of the ideas because it was such an interesting thing to dive into. But I think the first question I want to ask, and I ask all the guests this, what inspired you to write this book?
Yeah, it's interesting because actually this book in particular was really long in the making, only because it's had so many iterations. So the first time that I thought about this book was actually my senior year, or my last year in university. I went to Temple University. I studied the classics. And I remember us talking in one of my Roman history courses, we were talking about military decorations. And how you could get a military decoration, what they looked like. They were sort of almost like, modern day medals, where you get them for valor, you get them for saving your fellow soldier, you get them for being a great general. And it sort of struck me, because I think it was around Easter that we were having this conversation. I said, wait a minute, what were the Roman soldiers actually doing to Jesus during his mockery and crowning? And it struck me that they weren't having anything to do with Passover or Judaism or anything. They were thinking from their own perspective as military men. So it just made me rethink that entire episode in the Gospels. And so I had written a senior thesis about Jesus not as a failed king, but as a failed general. And then from there, I eventually did a PhD, mostly on early Christian and medieval art. And then this book came partially from the dissertation. So it's been a long time coming, but it's been a lot of fun, and it's gone through a lot of different iterations. And it's become more and more fun to write. When you're in the midst of a dissertation, it's very serious, very academic. And then when you're detached from that, you get to have more fun, with what you're writing. So I get to tell more stories. And Christian or not, the stories in the Gospels are fantastic, right? So you just get to sort of explode the imagination and turn things on their heads in ways that people didn't get to think. So I really enjoyed writing in the end, because you can go in so many different places.
And I really like the different ways you flick through and told the stories, but that recentering of Jesus' story from being inherently a Christian-centric view to looking at it from a Roman militaristic perspective was really interesting. But then I think before we get stuck into this conversation, I think we really need to look at what actually is the Crown of Thorns. What is it in our popular understanding before we go and look at its significance and its evolution?
Absolutely. And it's apt because we're approaching Easter. This is the season that the Christians call Lent. So if you'd like to read my book for your Lenten discipline, please do. But yes, and one of the things, whenever I give a talk on my book, I always like to make sure we're all on the same page, right? Because not everyone goes to church, not everyone knows the Christian tradition, but most people have probably seen the Crown of Thorns. Very basically, the Crown of Thorns shows up in the Gospels, shows up in the Gospel stories, and it happens when Jesus, who's the protagonist of the Gospels, he is in the Garden of Gethsemane, which is in Jerusalem, and he is betrayed by one of his best friends. It betrays him to Rome as almost a quasi-terrorist, right? Who's trying to lead the uprising against Rome. So he betrays him. He's taken into custody. He's taken to Pontius Pilate, who is the Roman governor of Judea, and he's put on trial. And part of this trial, Pontius Pilate decides, as part of his punishment, is to have him flogged while he sort of debates what to do with Jesus. And so he sends him out with his Roman soldiers, to have him flogged. And the Roman soldiers, they have some time on their hands, so they flog him. And then they decide to have a bit of a cruel game of their own. They put a purple cloak on his shoulders. They put a reed in his hand, and they weave this crown of thorns, they press it into his head, they smack him, they spit on him, and they mock him, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews." And it's a cruel joke. But this is where the crown of thorns comes from. This is where it comes into our more popular imagination. When we think of the crown of thorns, when most people hear crown of thorns, they have a very specific image that comes into their head. And that's this sort of sharp, painful, cruel thorns piercing into the bloodied brow of Christ. That's the image that's conjured, and it's everywhere, right? You walk through the halls of any of the museums in the UK, throughout Europe, throughout the US, everywhere. You'll walk through the halls into the Renaissance, the medieval period, whatever it is, even into the modern period, and you see images of the Passion or Jesus's time before his death. You see these images, and inevitably you have the crown of thorns, and it sticks with him, right, from the moment that he is with Pilate until his death and resurrection. This object stays on his head.
And I think that image of that crown is actually quite brutal.
Yeah.
And why is that brutality kind of associated with Jesus at this point, when it is a story of love, forgiveness, and care?
It's very interesting because I think in our popular imagination and what's happened with the art, and I think we'll talk a little bit about that, but when we think of the crown of thorns now, in our minds we think of intense suffering, of awful, awful torture. And it's this idea that, for the Christians anyway, is that Jesus suffered, right? Jesus endured pain so that we don't have to, right? So that Christians who believe in Jesus don't have to suffer pain and will be resurrected in heaven for everlasting eternal life, right? So it's this idea of we look at this suffering, we look at this pain, and we're reminded of the sacrifice that Jesus gave for us, as part of our mores, is that we too should sacrifice like Jesus, not as intensely, but we should try to imitate that so that we can help one another like Jesus did. But the idea of this suffering, of the blood, of the pain, I think that's mostly coming from a place where people who meditate on these images say, I don't have to do that, right? Because it was done for me.
And that context there about setting something to imitate Jesus with, being a brutal scene initiated by the Romans, and that crown being ubiquitous against millennia, really. And that symbol of the crown of thorns being something that we can meditate upon, or people have meditated upon. Is it actually being branches and sharp thorns the first ever depiction of it, or is it depicted differently?
Yeah, and it's so interesting that you say that this has been the image for millennia, because as you're hinting at there, it hasn't been, right? This image is, in the grand scheme of Passion iconography, which is huge, right? It's a huge, huge genre. The Crown of Thorns is relatively new. The first time that we do see the quote unquote Crown of Thorns is in the mid-4th century. Okay, and we see it on a sarcophagus that was found in an ancient cemetery just outside what would have been the walls of Rome. It's now in the Vatican. You can go see it. It's in the Cristiano Piso Museum or something like that, and it's gorgeous. It's gigantic, right? You can see it, and you can walk up to it, and it has these figures that almost leap off of the sarcophagus. And early Christian sarcophagi are a little hard to read. But you can see lots of figures that you'll find familiar. So you'll see Jesus. He's very youthful. He's beardless. He's kind of got this little childish, pudge. It's quite cute. And he's got his hair parted in the middle. It's curly. It's long compared to the other men on the sarcophagus. And he's there with an unmistakable Roman soldier. You'll see his special Roman soldier cloak, his special Roman soldier sandals, his special Roman soldier sword. And he's Jesus and the soldier. Jesus is gesturing in blessing. It's this sort of gesture here, gesturing in blessing towards Pilate, Pontius Pilate, that the governor I spoke about earlier. And Pilate is sitting on his special curial chair, which is his governor's chair, and it's sort of that S-shaped legs. And he's turned completely away from Jesus with his head in his hands, deep in thought. And he's thinking about whether or not to have Jesus sentenced to die by crucifixion. You go over to the other side of the sarcophagus, And there's a man, Simon of Cyrene is what he's called, and he's carrying Jesus' cross for him, right? Because Jesus no longer could carry his cross, so they pulled Simon of Cyrene from the seething masses to carry his cross for him. And then you have this last scene where another unmistakable Roman soldier is there with Jesus. Jesus is standing very calm, very collected. He has his wrist in one hand and a scroll in the other. And the Roman soldier is holding a sword in one hand, and he reaches up above Jesus' head, holding aloft this leafy wreath. This is the first instance of the mockery and crown of thorns. But you look at this image and you go, well, that can't be right. That's not what I understand in my popular imagination of the crown of thorns. Where are the thorns? Where's the crown? Where's the torture? Where's the suffering? Where's the humiliation? None of that's here. And instead, what we get is almost this loving crowning with wreath, with a leafy wreath. And so you have to ask yourself, what is going on here? This is some of the earliest depictions in Christian art are on these sarcophagi. And they can be a little strange to us. But this one in particular, where is the crown of thorns? And so you ask, why? What is it that these artists were trying to tell their audience, their early Christian audience, about the crown of thorns? And the answer might surprise you, because it doesn't have anything to do with suffering. It doesn't have anything to do with torture. What it is for the early Christians is a proper crowning of their victorious general, right, who has succeeded in some way. I think if you want me to talk about the backstory of that, I certainly can, or sort of why it came into being.
Yeah, that'd be really interesting to hear that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I have to take you a little bit back to the Romans, but that's fine because the Romans are fun. But the Romans, basically, they took over direct control of Judea in 6 A.D. Most people probably know Herod the Great. Herod the Great, he dies in 4 B.C. He's succeeded by one of his sons, Archelaus. Archelaus is absolute rubbish. He cannot keep it together. Everyone is rebelling all the time. He slaughters thousands of his own people on a regular basis. Eventually, Augustus, the emperor, says, right, well, I've had enough of this because honestly, the economy over there is tanking and you guys bring in a lot of money. So we need to stop this. So he exiles Archelaus to somewhere horrible like France. And then he says, no more king of the Jews, right? No more king of the Jews. Instead, he puts Judea under direct Roman rule, which means that instead of a king from their own people, which is the preference, and though they didn't really like Archelaus, that's certainly the preference for the Judeans, now they have a Roman military man leading their province, and he's known as a prefect. The most famous prefect of all, probably of all of the Roman Empire, is Pontius Pilate. Pontius Pilate was the 5th prefect of Rome, and he ruled for about 10 years, which is a long time. It's a long time to rule a province, and it's certainly a long time to rule Judea. After that, not most prefects didn't rule for that long. And he ruled with an iron fist. He was more impatient than his predecessors. He could be cruel and brutal at times. Josephus, the near contemporary historian, really didn't like Pontius Pilate. But in some ways, Pilate had to be brutal because the first century Judea just sort of had this seething, simmering resentment that was always under the surface. Because they did not want to be under direct Roman rule. They would have much preferred that Augustus choose another king from amongst their own people rather than come under direct Roman military rule. And so what would occasionally happen is this violence would just erupt out of nowhere, right? Because underneath this sort of simmering, seething resentment, you'd have this violence erupt. And it would always be started by what was known as a messianic leader, right? And we know there were a lot of messianic leaders. Josephus, who I just mentioned, he talks about maybe about, 3 or 4 before what would have been Jesus's messianic mission, and then a whole bunch more after that into the lead up of the Great Jewish Revolt and the destruction of the temple. And these messianic leaders, they had a bunch of characteristics in common. They always preached that they were either a Messiah or a prophet that has come from God to lead their people out of oppression. Single-handedly, they would lead their people out of oppression into salvation and a new regime, and they would destroy their oppressors, i.e. the Romans, right? So they were always pretty violent. They were always very charismatic, and they were military men. So they would not just gather a huge crowd to themselves to preach, but they would often gather a huge armed crowd to themselves. And they would always have some sort of ill-conceived battle plan that the Romans would inevitably, brutally quash, right? The Romans met insolence with violence, and at least in Judea, they won pretty much every time. But then, so we have this sort of basis of the messianic leader in first century Judea. So your question is going to be, okay, what about Jesus? Right? Because as you said earlier, okay, we've got all this suffering and torture, but Jesus is, a lot of what he preaches that we know is love, forgiveness, everlasting life, salvation, peace. This is not the tone of a violent military man. But if you look at the Gospels, Jesus doesn't help himself all the time, right? In public, a lot of the times, he acts like just another messianic leader. And the problem is, of course, is that all the Roman soldiers who have to deal with these messianic leaders all the time, and they just absolutely ruin their week, right? And they're frustrating, and they, take a lot of lives, and they have to always be quelling these rabble rousers. They would have seen Jesus as just another messianic leader. And there's proof of that, right? So we have Jesus doing things like expelling and destroying and killing a demon or an evil spirit called legion, right? And in the Gospels, which were originally written in Greek, the word legion is legion, right? So it's not just another Greek word for a large part of the army. It's a transliteration of a Roman military word. And the moral of the story is that Jesus can destroy a legion, right? It doesn't help him that, all of his disciples are armed. I talked about the Garden of Gethsemane when he was betrayed by his friend. During that, all of his disciples pull out their daggers and swords that they have concealed, waiting for their great general to call them to arms. And so they're all fighting. And Jesus says, stop the fighting. Do you not think that I could call upon my Father and he will at once send me more than 12 legions of angels? Why would he get 12 legions of angels? Because he's a general. So you have these sort of snippets all the way through where you see Jesus displaying the characteristics of a typical messianic leader. And we all know that he drew a crowd, right? And of course the Romans hate a crowd because they're sort of like a hair's breadth away from violence, even today, right? Doesn't matter 2,000 years ago today. Peaceful crowds are pretty close to violence. And so he displays all of these things. And so what you find in the mockery and crowning of Christ is not the crowning of a failed king, right? But what the Roman soldiers would actually see is that Jesus, as a general, as this sort of messianic general, he was supposed to save his people, single-handedly save his people from death and destruction. And he failed in the eyes of the Romans. And so they mock him by crowning him with a wreath as a general to say, here is your wreath for your very incredible deed. You've saved your people. But they know they're about to kill him. And so we find the crowning of a general, a mock crowning of a general by the Roman soldiers. But then what you see is the Christian audience behind that. Because for them, this was a proper crowning. For them, for the Christians, Jesus did indeed, single-handedly, as a general would, save his people from death and destruction and bring them into everlasting life through his death, right? And then you go back and you look at this sarcophagus, and that's exactly what's happening. They've taken the torture and the torment and the humiliation, and they've turned it on its head. And they've said, this is a proper crowning for a proper general who did what he said he would do. And that's the background of the Crown of Thorns. Yeah, go ahead.
How does that evolve from, because those images are not something that a traditional or even a medieval Christian audience would recognize. Like you're saying, quite a baby face, clean shaven Jesus, a leafy crown, and then we have this transformation into a bearded, quite mature looking Jesus, often absolutely shredded on a crucifix,
Yeah.
and then a quite brutal crown of thorns. So where does that evolution happen, and why are the medieval people depicting him in that way?
Absolutely. So what the funny thing is about this image, this great grand image that I've taken some time to explain, is that you see the mockery and the crowning, and then you don't see it again for 700 years. 700 years, long after Passion iconography has been developed. Most things in Passion iconography have been developed by now. You've got your betrayal, you've got your flagellations, you've got your ecce homos, where Pilate says, "Behold the man," right? And you have your crucifixion, but you have no crown of thorns. And it's almost as if it's just been forgotten until, springing almost out of zero artistic precedence, and I say almost because there is some, but very, very little from Passion iconography, almost out of no artistic precedence whatsoever, we suddenly have, in the 11th century, a fully formed crown, an actual, like a crown you and I would think of as a crown for a king, with these little thorns poking out the top and out the bottom, and the mockery. So Jesus is sitting in this image, and there are a few of them that come out in the 11th century, early 11th century, first quarter, and he's seated on a throne with cushions. And on either side of him, you have these attendants almost, right? They have their hands in this gesture like this. This is a gesture of acclamation or adoration. It's pretty typical in medieval art. And they're expectorating on him, they're spitting on him, and they have one, maybe one of them is putting a reed in his hand, and the other one is slapping him with their other hand. So it's kind of a weird gestures, but you can see this acclamation. And Jesus is sitting there, reed in hand, Bible in the other, with this crown made of thorns being put on his head. Where is this coming from? We've never seen it before. So you look around, right? You look around at the art of the medieval world, and there's this one image that's everywhere in medieval art. We're talking sort of Ottonians, Salians. So these are the descendants of the Carolingians, right? So Charlemagne, and then the Ottonians. If you think sort of medieval Germany, right, you're sort of getting in the right area. So late 10th, early 11th through the 11th century. And everywhere we start to see this one image. It's in manuscripts, you see it on monumental imagery, and it's the coronation of the king. So you've got your Ottos, you've got your Henrys, and inevitably they're being enthroned and crowned, because after the chaos of the Carolingian period, especially the end of the Carolingian period where it was absolute madness, they needed to establish the king as a real rock solid center of power. And one way they did that was through the coronation. It legitimized them. But the other way they did that was through Jesus, right? So the king, in his capacity as king, had to imitate Christ. He had to be Christ's most perfect imitator on earth. And that included being humiliated, which doesn't compute for us, right, necessarily with kings. But the medieval kingship, kings, in order to legitimize their coronation, to legitimize their kingship, to legitimize the fact that they were Christ's representative on earth, had to, in the course of their life leading up to their coronation, had to have been deeply humiliated, deep suffering, deep humiliation in their life. And to endure through that humiliation and suffering, to come out the other side better than they were. This legitimized their kingship. And they were doing this as Christ did on earth. So we talked about sort of the flagellation and the crown of thorns and the mockery. This was all deeply humiliating. This was suffering. This was torture. But Jesus endures all of this. He endures crucifixion, and in the end gains the highest throne in heaven. And likewise, the medieval kings. It's just this neat parallel, right? Likewise, the medieval kings had to endure humiliation, endure suffering, and come out the other side to reach the highest earthly throne and be crowned king. And so you start to see the legitimacy of the coronation is then paralleled in the imagery of Jesus. So you see almost this direct, and if you look at the coronation of the kings in manuscripts, you have him seated on a throne, a cushioned throne. You have attendants on either side of him with this gesture of acclamation. They're not spitting on him, but they have this gesture of acclamation. He's got a scepter in one hand, or, like a reed, and then he's got an orb, kind of like the Bible in the other hand. And he's got these people on either side of him acclaiming that he has gone through this humiliation and has gained his earthly throne. And so these images start to crop up, not because there's any artistic precedent, but because they are legitimizing the king. So it's the medieval imagery of kingship that allowed the crown of thorns and mockery to come into being, which is crazy. And you wouldn't think it, but it's this point that we suddenly have the mockery and the crown of thorns in the medieval, because of medieval kingship.
So with this idea of kings trying to replicate Jesus, I think there's so many different strands I want to pick on and dive into. I think most crucially to me, it kind of shows a different kind of tone in paintings and illustrations, and not only Jesus, but those imitating him, where that early depiction of Jesus and the mockery and the passion on the sarcophagus is quite loving. And we've talked about this, Jesus depiction is quite loving, quite caring. But then as you go further and you have Jesus enthroned, people spitting on him, and those depictions becoming increasingly aggressive and showing him having more pain, why is there that difference? And why, and also, why do, and I know you want to, we're giving that idea of legitimacy, but why do people want to show themselves going through that pain as well? Because it's quite a, that treatment of Christ that we see from the medieval period is incredibly brutal when compared to that depiction on the sarcophagus.
I think that there are a couple things in play here. First of all, early Christian art, as you say, it's very loving. It's, you've got this youthful Jesus, you've got sarcophagi in that same museum that I talked about earlier, where he's holding a wand in order to perform miracles, right? It's very different. And it's really only his miracles that he performed on earth that you see depicted. Very rarely do you get things like the Passion. That Passion sarcophagus is rare. But it's mostly about his mission. And you just don't see pain. You don't see suffering. You don't see torture, because that's not what the early Christians wanted to talk about. And not for much longer, but it was a very embarrassing way for your God to die. It was only something that criminals and foreigners could be killed by. It was deep, prolonged suffering, something that, none of us will experience this kind of suffering. And the Romans knew how to be cruel. So it was embarrassing. It was embarrassing to have your God be treated like this. And it took some time for Christians to artistically, and I say artistically because it didn't take them long to, martyrs also thought, I know I'm going to die like Christ. And they were really, really annoying to the Romans because they'd rather die for their God, right, than live honorably. And they found that incredibly irritating. It was in art that they didn't for a long time depict suffering. And even crucifixion scenes are very rare in early art, and it takes some time. But once crucifixion is no longer a thing, once Christianity is sort of taken over Europe and it becomes the rise of Christendom, more and more you'll see suffering. More and more you'll see the endurance that Jesus went through as an example to his followers, right? And that's that sort of shift that very slowly starts to happen. You see, especially in something like the crucifixion scene, early on, Jesus will have his eyes open, wide awake, already alive, already resurrected on the cross, right? And then later on, especially in the Crusader period, you'll start to see crucifixions with Jesus unmistakably dead, right? Because this is representative of the sacrifice that, say, the Crusaders were making, right? They too were imitating Christ with their sacrifice and their death for Christendom. right? And that's where those parallels start to happen. But another part of the answer to your question is about this sort of age-old concept of zero to hero. You have a lot of leaders in the modern day, in the ancient world. They had to suffer. They had to endure, and they took this endurance, they took this suffering, they took this torment, these sort of difficult times they had to go through, and they made it what legitimized them, what made them great leaders, right? So you see it, of course, in the medieval period, but you even think back to, Odysseus, right? He had to go through quite a lot. He got lost in the Mediterranean for a long time. He lost his kingdom pretty much. He had to come back from glory to nothing to glory again. Julius Caesar was captured by pirates. He had to endure a lot before he became dictator and then was killed by his friends. But that's another story. And you see this over and over and over again, even in our modern day, right? You think about people like Trump, right? When he had his favorite image of himself as his mugshot, right? And so he took this idea of what should have been deeply, deeply humiliating, but made it heroic, right? And you see it in leadership across the board. Doesn't matter what you think about these people, right? It's the idea of zero to hero. And it's not new. This has been going on for thousands and thousands of years, and Jesus is no different. And the imitators of Jesus are no different. In order to legitimize our leadership, we have to suffer like Jesus did.
I think this might be a slightly off on a tangent here, but how important then is the centralization of Christianity under the papacy in the depictions of these images? Because you go through so many councils, Nicene Council and so on, it's controlling the way that Christianity is taught and depicted in the Bibles. We lose gospels through these councils. How important is that centralization of the religion in showing how Christ is depicted?
Yeah, I think it is important because as you say, you've got all these sort of gospels flying around. You have the three, what's called the synoptic gospels, which are Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Mark was the first one that was written, and then the other two sort of followed and were very, very similar gospels. And then you have John, which is the fourth gospel. His gospel is written a bit later, and it's technically an apology, right? It's technically sort of a defense of the quote unquote mainstream Christianity of the time. And his apologies against the Gnostics, who had this sort of very, very strange way of thinking about Christianity. And a lot of people thought it wasn't quite in keeping with the synoptic gospels. And so John writes his gospel as an apology. And you can see him throughout. If it's John's gospel and all of the philosophy that runs through it makes more sense if you know something about Gnosticism, because he takes Gnosticism and again turns it on his head. That's a big theme with the early Christians. And so I think making Christianity sort of more mainstream, and these are the kind of things that we are going to do them now, and it takes forever, right? And even amongst monastery rules and things like that, you have lots of fluctuations. But the thing you have to remember about the medieval world is that it was very fractured. So even if you have, all of these congresses coming together to try to decide what's right in Christianity, it's actually very hard to get people together in the medieval world, right? It's very, very fractured. So in art, what you find is that the art is influenced really by the world around the artists, by the theology, by the philosophy, by the politics of the time. And so when you're looking at a piece of art, you can say, okay, maybe this image kind of looks like the one that I saw in a 4th century sarcophagus, so it must be coming from that. But you got to be careful with that, because in the medieval world, who's seen this sarcophagus? We only dug it up in the 9th century. So it's you have to remember that these artists are taking their influence from the world directly around them. And sometimes people come in from other places, they bring their ideas, they bring the masters of art of these schools will come in, they'll teach these students, but even so, they're taking bits and pieces from what's around them. And you think about, for example, the Crusades. I mentioned the Crusades earlier, but Crusader art is very interesting in this as well, because you look at this very specific time and place that almost has an art all of its own. Because yes, it's taking Eastern art, most specifically the Byzantine art, but then you have some masters coming from the West to lead schools. So that's a conflation of both their art. Then you see all of these localizing elements that brings the art made in that time and place, made in the Crusader states, all its own. And so, yes, again, you can say a lot of these things were developed because by making sort of Christianity, this is what we're going to believe, this is what the true belief is. But really, when it comes to the art, you have to consider what's going on in its time and place, and make sure that you're taking your understanding. As we looked at, you can't just say enthroned mockery. Could be coming from this piece of art that I found, somewhere in Italy, even though my enthroned mockery is coming from Germany. You have to look at it in its time and place, because they're not really coming from each other. So that's what I would say, is making sure you take things in their time and place.
So through this kind of fractured Europe and at the Holy Land across in the East, how is it that the Crown of Thorns, with the actual thorns and the more brutal depiction of the mockery and the Passion of Christ, is the one that has endured and persisted over this more overt image of a victory and triumph?
Absolutely. This imagery of victory and triumph, and what's interesting about that is that has its basis in early Christian art, in early Christian patristics, in theology. And that's probably part of the reason it took so long for it to develop the way that it did, because the Crown of Thorns was so stuck in this idea of triumph that it was hard to conflate it with death and pain. So it took a long time for it to happen. The Ottonians and Salians helped, right? So they brought this idea of a crown made of thorns into art through the coronation, because they wanted the crown to look like their crown, right? And so that's where you start to get that idea of adding the thorns. And of course, linguistically, Latin changes, right? So in the Greek New Testament, we have, it's called a Stephanos ex acanthon, which is a wreath made out of acanthus, which is a type of weed, and it's a very, very important plant. But then, Saint Jerome translates it into a coronam de spinas, which is a wreath, and then later on means crown. Okay, so as Latin changes, you get the crown specifically made of thorns. So it's partially linguistic, but I think the big change for the Crown of Thorns, for this imagery, is Louis IX of France. He purchases the Crown of Thorns and brings it back to France. And Paris is, at this time, and other times before that, this time especially, they're trying to make it the New Jerusalem. And bringing relics like the Crown of Thorns over to this New Jerusalem, to Paris, really solidifies the Crown of Thorns in art, because it becomes something tangible for Europe. We don't hear a lot about the relic of the Crown of Thorns before Louis. Some pilgrims talk about it in their travel logs, I like to call them, where they talk about, oh, I went to this church and I saw a piece of the cross, and oh yeah, the Crown of Thorns was there too, and oh, but I seriously saw a piece of the cross. And so they're more excited about other relics than the Crown of Thorns. But it's mentioned in the 5th century, it's mentioned in the 9th, and then it's mentioned in the 11th, and eventually it's in Constantinople, and then Louis purchases it and brings it back. And he brings it back, along with our theme of humiliating leaders. He takes off all of his kingly garb, loses his crown, loses his jewels, takes off his shoes, walks barefoot through Paris, which in the medieval world, I know it's bad now, but that would have been bad, takes barefoot through the streets of Paris, holding aloft the Crown of Thorns, right? He humiliates himself, he humbles himself, because this is part of his kingship. And it makes a lot of sense to carry the Crown of Thorns, the most humiliating part of Jesus's passion, through the streets of Paris. And then he builds the Sainte-Chapelle, which you can go see today. It was his private chapel. It was part of the palace, and he built it. And it's architecturally, if there's any medieval architect fanatics out there, it's a brilliant one for you, because how that thing stands up is incredible. So he has this sort of this stained glass artistic program, and right in the middle, right where the altar would have been, right where the Crown of Thorns would have been, he has an image of Jesus enthroned, being crowned, just like him, right? Just like Louis. And he brings it back. So he brings back this enthroned mockery. He brings back the idea of being humiliated and being crowned at the same time. And the image has now become a woven crown of thorns. And because of this, it's then solidified in art. You start to see it more, not just during his mockery. You see more of the mockery. You see more of the crown of thorns. And then eventually the crown of thorns starts following Jesus through the rest of his passion and through the rest of his time on trial, while he's walking through the streets of Jerusalem, and then while he's crucified, and then sometimes even plays a role in the resurrection as part of the objects or the instruments of the passion. So I think it really comes down to Louis and the relic eventually. But interestingly, the relic had no influence on the mockery and the crown of thorns until it was brought to Europe. And you can go see it today in the Notre Dame. It's on display every Friday, I think.
And I think it's really interesting how he's bought that relic, and it's been able to define how he sees his own medieval kingship. And I think the idea of kingship here in medieval Europe being intrinsically tied up with religion is quite interesting.
Mm. Yeah, and I think that makes a lot of sense for the medieval period, because again, it's that whole idea of having to be Christ-like, and this idea of what's called Christomimesis, if you're looking for a new vocabulary word, but it means basically the imitation or the mimicry of Christ. And I think that a lot of people, medieval world would look to their king, or they were asked to look to their king as that representative on earth. And he was crowned by archbishops and the Pope eventually, and that really legitimized his representation as Christ's anointed, right? Like the new David in the new Jerusalem, he is Christ's anointed.
And I think this is a really nice point, Faith, to ask you a final fun question, as we do for all the guests here on the podcast. We've spoken about so many different types of Jesus' crowns, one of thorns, one of leaf year depiction, but which is your favourite?
Yeah, no, this is a fun question, because I have to say it's probably that first enthroned mockery that I found in the manuscript, and it's Saint Peter's Gospel. It's now housed in the Morgan Library in New York, and I remember just coming across it and going, "This is bonkers. Where did this even come from?" You know, it just came out of nowhere, and it was just this perfect mockery crown of thorns scene. And the other thing that I love about it, not only did it just sort of explode my understanding of the crown of thorns and was such a mystery to solve, you know, where did this come from? It was so fun. But the other thing I love about it is that I got to see it in person. You know, one of the perks of being a PhD student, back when I was, is that you can request to see these manuscripts, and you know, I'm very grateful to the Morgan Library for letting me view it, because if I hadn't been able to see it, because there aren't that many great pictures of it out there, I wouldn't have noticed what I had been able to notice. Right? I wouldn't have seen their spit flying at Jesus. I wouldn't have been able to really see in the context of this image, so where it is in the gospel, and even down to the things of where the manuscript had been sewn back together, because they're animal skin, right? So they come apart and they sew them back together. Oh, it's beautiful. And so the ability even just to handle the manuscript was extraordinary. So that's one of my favorites, A Crown of Thorns, I think.
I think that's incredible answer. I really like that. And that is the best thing about being a historian. You get to see these things in person as well.
Exactly. Please let me see your ancient artifact.
I'm going to have to do it even more.
Do it.
But then, obviously people have been listening to us talk about your work and your book, and there's so much more in the book that we haven't touched on within this hour. So where can people go and grab a copy of The Crown of Thorns?
Yes, they can go to bloomsbury.com. They can search Tibble, Tibble, and they can find it there. Or you can go to Amazon, UK and US, and search Faith Tibble. There are other Tibbles out there, so do Faith Tibble, and you'll find it there. And yeah, that's where you can go to find it.
Fantastic. And I'll make sure a link for that is in the description below, so people can go and grab a copy. And then where can they keep up to date with you and your work?
Yes, you can go to Instagram. My handle is Dr. Faith Tibble. I'm also on X as Faith Tibble.
Awesome. Well, they'll all be in the description below, so people can go away, follow you, and look at some more of your work that you've got coming up. But thank you very much for coming on, Faith.
This has been such fun. Thank you so much, Jackson.
10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
The History with Jackson podcast.